forum portion, can we address this? Public forum portion of our welcoming the NATO Parliamentary Assembly to Dayton, Ohio. We are welcoming the NATO Parliamentary Assembly here, and we're also undertaking, as part of this Dayton Dialogue Public Forum and as part of the work that the NATO Parliamentary Assembly is doing, a commemoration of the 30th anniversary of the Dayton Peace Accords, both a retrospective and a prospective on the work that was done with the Dayton Peace Accords, looking to how do we bring an end to conflict, the work that it tells us, both in the conflict of Ukraine, but also in looking at the Balkans itself and what we have to do on our to-do list, both as the United States, NATO, and with our European allies. This portion of the Dayton Dialogue in its public forum is entitled, Why Does NATO Matter to Everyday Americans? And we have a great panel. First off, I want to thank the Atlantic Council, and a personal thanks to Fred Kemp, who has come to lead this panel. He's going to be participating in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and will be opening our afternoon and opening sessions of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. He's been a leader in the transatlantic relationship and in the transatlantic dialogue, which has been incredibly important in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly and in the formulation of a lot of the policies that they have adopted and in the debates that have occurred there. We have two members of Congress who will be on the panel, Congressman Rick Larsen and Congressman Neil Dunn, both of which who are delegates at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly representing the United States, Rick Larsen from Washington State and Neil Dunn from Florida. And then we're very honored that we have representing us today the U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Ambassador Whitaker. He is a former acting Attorney General for the United States and Chief of Staff to the Attorney General Jeff Sessions and U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Iowa. What's extraordinary is he is a strong voice for the United States at NATO, representing the Trump administration, but also representing us at a time where Europe has the question of where is the United States. He's able to answer the question, we're right here. We're strong. We're the United States. We're part of NATO. We're part of the transatlantic relationship. And we are calling our European allies to step to the plate to make certain that they are meeting their obligation, but the United States is not weakening its. In this dialogue that we're going to have today, each of the partners will have, the participants will have their unique contribution to the question, why does NATO matter to everyday Americans? And we look forward to their contributions today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello.
So, Representative Turner, can everyone hear me?
Okay.
So thank you for that kind introduction, but more than that, thank you for your leadership over so many years in the Congress, as a leader of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, and really an inspiration to so many people about American leadership in the world. I will be leading off the NATO Parliamentary Assembly tomorrow on Ukraine, and part of what I'm going to say about the history of Dayton is we've come here to commemorate history, but we've also come here to interrogate history and talk about the lessons it has for the future. When the Atlantic Council was born, the organization that I run, in 1961, so 64 years ago today, there were worries about American support for NATO. It was only a dozen years old, but there was really concern even then. It seems perennial that there's concern about U.S. support for NATO, U.S. continuation in NATO. That was also at the time of that we had lost our nuclear monopoly, which during the Berlin airlift in 1948 was part of the reason we were able to break the Soviet embargoes. We had a nuclear monopoly. The Soviet Union was making inroads into the developing world that the Kennedy administration was worried about, and we were facing a Berlin crisis, which was divided among post-war World War II powers. I wrote about that in a book I called Berlin 1966. Kenny Khrushchev in the most dangerous place in the world. At that time, and this gets to the point of our panel today, the Atlantic Council decided to run a national advertising campaign in the 1960s and then again in the early 70s. We enlisted the support of two famous Americans because we thought that was the best way to reach out to Americans. One of them was the entertainer Bob Hope, and the other was the Dallas Cowboys quarterback Roger Staubach. And a lot of the full-page ads in national newspapers were really trying to bring home why it was important that Americans, and why it was in the U.S. interest that Americans back NATO. So fast forward to today, we have a whole new set of circumstances. Russia's war in Europe, tensions in China, a new competition with a new set of autocratic adversaries, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, a competition for the commanding heights of technology. One wonders whether one needs a new campaign about why NATO matters for everyday Americans, employing whatever the Bob Hope, Roger Staubach equivalent for today's America would be. For most Americans going about their daily lives, the value of NATO may not always be obvious, but it's there in the stability that allows our economy to grow, in the military security that prevents conflicts from reaching the American homeland, in the deterrence that allows the transatlantic community to flourish economically. Indeed, the 80 years since World War II, we commemorated this month the 80th anniversary of VE Day, have been the longest period in modern memory of major power, peace, and growing prosperity. Will Americans continue to support NATO in the years ahead? Why should they? How does America need to change to win how does NATO need to change to win American support? In short, why does it matter to everyday Americans? So to answer that, we've got some first-rate panelists here. Ambassador Matthew Whitaker is the U.S. Permanent Representative to NATO. Ambassador, congratulations on assuming this new role. He previously served as Acting Attorney General of the United States, and more on Ambassador Whitaker in a moment. Please.
Yes! One person.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mom. Yeah, I was here.
And now, for the representatives have to get equal or greater applause.
They will. Everybody loves their congressman.
We've got the applause meter on right now. Representative Neil Dunn is a U.S. Congressman representing Florida's 2nd District since 2017. He sits on the House Select Committee on the strategic competition between the United States and Chinese Communist Party. Impressively, he's also a medical doctor, having served for 11 years in the U.S. Army Medical Corps, achieving the rank of major. So, Ambassador Neil Dunn. Representative Neil Dunn. Representative Rick Larson is a U.S. Congressman representing Washington's 2nd District since 2001. He sits on the House Armed Services Committee. He's the ranking member of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Representative Dunn is a Republican. Representative Larson is a Democrat, underscoring the bipartisan support for NATO and the bipartisan nature of the Atlantic Council. Please, a round of applause for Representative Larson. Thank you. So let me start with Ambassador Whitaker. You recently announced that President Trump would travel to The Hague in June for the NATO summit. Can you discuss what deliverables the President wants from this year's summit? What would success look like for him? How are those deliverables relevant to everyday Americans? And I just saw Ambassador Whitaker and his amazing staff in Brussels with the Atlantic Council delegation. And I think it's fair to say that Europe is moving right now to take care of its defense more quickly, more soundly, certainly because of the threat from Vladimir Putin, but also for the positive pressure being put on by the Trump administration to do some burden shifting, burden sharing. But I'd love to hear your answer to President trips to The Hague and what he expects.
Yeah, well, thank you, Fred, and it's good to be here in Dayton, Ohio. You know, I always, any opportunity I have to come back to the Midwest, I always enjoy as an Iowan. We won't get into Big Ten football, I promise.
I do have an intention to do that, by the way.
But we do plan on President Trump being at The Hague for this year's summit, and the big deliverable to your question is really burden sharing. President Trump has made very clear that our European and Canadian allies need to equalize with the United States. Right now, the United States spends Well, the newest budget proposal, and the congressman will have a better picture as to what's actually going to pass, is a proposal of $1 trillion on defense spending for the United States. And right now Europe is spending, including Canada, about $550 billion. So we're almost twice as much. And so we're hoping that will equalize, and that Europe will ramp up dramatically their defense spending. And remember 11 years ago now, there was the Wales Pledge, which everyone agreed to 2% of GDP on defense spending. And it's taken several of our allies the full 11 years since then to get to 2%. Some of them are still not there, and they've promised to be there by the meeting in The Hague on the 25th of June. I'm not sure they're actually going to be there, but I'm looking at you, Spain and Belgium and some others. But the new commitment, what I'm terming the Hague Defense Commitment, because it's more than a pledge, it's more than a plan, it's a true commitment, like a marriage, is 5% of GDP on defense and defense-related items. And this is about real capabilities. All the allies have agreed within the NATO alliance to bringing capabilities. Hopefully it's all about deterrence, it's all about defending NATO territory, but if war were to break out in a NATO allied country or with NATO countries, and we all had to show up on the battlefield under the command of the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, an American four-star general, you are expected to bring certain things to the fight. Some people have to bring howitzers, some bring F-35, some bring air defense systems. I mean, it is a burden sharing, a burden shifting, but a true capabilities for the warfighter. And all this is, I really believe, because of President Trump's leadership and a true belief that the American taxpayers, you, should not bear the full burden of European transatlantic defense. And so this is a moment where we can take the burden that's been on the United States taxpayer for too long, for 76 years, as long as NATO has been around. But it is also an opportunity for since Eisenhower, President Eisenhower was complaining about how the Europeans weren't taking enough responsibility for their own defense. And so this is a real moment in time, to Fred's point, for that true alliance, for the European and Canadian pillar of NATO to step up and equalize. And what does it mean to you? It not only means that the burden is shifted away from you, the American taxpayer. It allows the United States of America to adjust and pivot and address our largest security needs, but at the same time, it creates jobs. It creates jobs here in Ohio, creates jobs in Iowa, it creates jobs all over the United States, because that increased defense spending oftentimes is going to be spent with American companies that are making the best war material in the history of mankind. So, let's just continue down this path. It's not lost on me that it's Memorial Day weekend, that we, kind of are celebrating our warriors, some of which were lost, many of which, hundreds of thousands, were lost on the battlefields of Europe. And so let's be strong, let's have peace through strength, but let's also share equally with our allies this burden so that we can be the shining city on the hill.
Thank you for that answer. I will come back to the defense spending, the jobs it could create in a minute. But let me come to the Big Ten. So you're not Roger Staubach of the Dallas Cowboys. However, it is Iowa. Many people in the audience may not know this. You were a tight end, contributed to a Big Ten.
And yet nobody has yelled out, "Go Hawks." That's very disappointing. This crowd, I expected more.
I'm waiting.
No,
I'm still didn't get it. You played in the Rose Bowl against the University of Washington. Representative Larson, we won't talk about
he already did. Mentioned it, yeah.
I did it behind closed doors, so we wouldn't have to embarrass him.
It wasn't the best day for Iowa, but it was the most points ever scored in the Rose Bowl to that time. You see, I did my research on this. So were you the Roger Staubach voice today? You were putting an ad in U.S. newspapers, Morning Register, whatever, in terms of your fellow players and what most Americans would understand. What's the value of NATO to them?
Well, I mean, one, it's what I mentioned earlier, and so I want to make sure that we all understand the value of NATO is a place to bring our friends together, our allies, those that we share values with in a common alliance. It's the strongest, most successful alliance in world history, and it also facilitates things like interoperability standards. Whether it's for ammunition, for artillery shells, and for everything, communication systems, cybersecurity, all sorts of a clearinghouse for that. But then it also, because of what we're doing with our Indo-Pacific partners like Japan and Australia and New Zealand and South Korea, together with Middle Eastern partners and others, it really is, I would say, an alliance of the free world. And it's an ability for us to coordinate and collaborate, and it's wildly successful. But I go back, we cannot have the United States bear an unreasonable and disproportionate burden of NATO. And so I've been very clear with our allies as I've been over in Brussels communicating this very message. But it's a team. It's war fighting is a team sport. But the problem is you're only as strong as your weakest link. And so we need to make sure that these capabilities that I just mentioned for all of our allies are strong and capable so that they can fight a modern war.
It's a terrific answer.
Thank you. Are you going to grade our answers now?
Yeah, now it's over to them to see if they...
I'll be the judge of that.
Exactly.
So Representatives Larson and Dunn, I'm going to ask this first question to both of you. You're from different parties. Geographically in the United States, you couldn't be further apart, Washington State and Florida. And I'd imagine NATO isn't the first issue of importance for your constituents. But nevertheless, in a poll done in April by Pew Research Foundation, it found that 60% of Americans hold a favorable view of the alliance. 2024 poll, Reagan Institute, shows 72% of Americans support the alliance's collective defense principle. But this is at a time when a lot of Americans are questioning the cost of international engagement, questioning the cost and the value to them. So starting with you, Congressman Larson, how does NATO figure in your constituency? How have you seen that move over your time in the House of Representatives? And is there a difference among Democrats and Republicans? So first, Congressman Larson, then Congressman Dunn.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for allowing me to be here. I thank Mike Turner and his team for putting this together, and the University of Dayton for hosting us here today. It's great to meet Ambassador Whitaker and wish him all the best on our behalf, on the behalf of the U.S. and Brussels, to help us do our work in Congress to support NATO and communicate the message that you're talking about. I want to answer this, and I'll try to be brief, but it's hard. I'm a member of Congress. But by talking about an everyday American, a guy named Robert Carlene, who at the age of 18, just after his 18th birthday, enlisted in the U.S. Army in December of 1941 after Japan attacked the U.S. and then declared war on the U.S. Germany declared war on the U.S. So he and a lot of his friends in Erie, Pennsylvania, enlisted in the U.S. Army to go fight. He was the son of Swedish immigrants, born here in the U.S., and figured it was important to fight for the United States, and he did. 4 years later, he was at the Elbe, and for those who know a little bit of history, the U.S. Army was on one side of the Elbe, the Russian army is on the other side of the Elbe, waiting to hear from Eisenhower and from the Russian military leadership who was going to get into Berlin first, and happened to be the Russians. But during that time, Robert learned Russian. He spoke Swedish at home, so the Army taught him Russian, learned how to shoot a machine gun. He certainly engaged in that effort as well. He took his VA benefits, became a professor, and so on. So he went over to fight on a continent for a lot of people he did not know. But he did it because it was right to fight for that freedom against fascism, for democracy against authoritarianism. He did it without knowing most of the people, if not everyone in the United States. He knew very few people in the United States, But still, he and a lot of his friends from Erie, Pennsylvania did it because it was the right thing to do. And that's one story of an everyday American. I'll give it the second story about an everyday American is his grandson, Per, who's my son. So I married Robert's daughter, Tia. And Per had the benefit of attending a few Memorial Day concerts at the U.S. Capitol as a son of a member of Congress. And literally, that's his reason for having joined the United States Navy after getting a mechanical engineering degree. And he's down in right next door to Neil's district, if you want to. We're not that far away. He's down there learning how to fly in the Navy, Navy airplane. He'll probably be in a certain platform that we use to look for submarines around the world. And he's doing it because he loves the country, he loves democracy, he loves freedom, and he's doing it on behalf of a lot of people he's never met in his life. 370 million Americans. He knows very few of us, but he's doing it because he believes it's the right thing to do. It's an important thing to do. So that's another story of an everyday American who is just giving up one thing to go do another thing on behalf of the country. So I think regardless of what I say today, I just want to make the point that there are everyday Americans today who are making these choices because they see representing the country, representing the values that we have of freedom, of democracy, of openness, of transparency, is important enough to give up some other things. Not that everyone has to do that, and that is not the case I'm making at all. Everyone is busy doing a lot of great things, and they're everyday Americans too, and they need to do those things. And every once in a while, there's these other young people who also decide that their thing to do as an everyday American is to drop everything else, even today, and defend some of those same values that their grandfathers and grandmothers did. So that's the kind of the story I wanted to tell about everyday Americans. Now, my district, and I'll end quickly, a lot of things going on. I am about as far north and west in the lower 48 as you can get from Washington, D.C. And everyone I represent loves the fact that they're not in Washington, D.C., that they're in Washington. And they're really far away from Washington, D.C. And so communicating at home about NATO can be difficult. But when you consider that I'm in the top 20 of 435 districts in the country with Ukrainian Americans, people understand, you don't have to play more than two degrees of Kevin Bacon, the game 6 degrees, 2 degrees of Kevin Bacon to find a Ukrainian American neighbor or someone who's a friend of a Ukrainian neighbor. And those folks are very concerned about what's happening in Europe, especially in Ukraine, and why NATO is important. You've got other people as well who watch what's going on in Europe and understand that if we didn't have a NATO over the last 70 years, it's very possible we could have been doing some of these things closer to the U.S. Or in the U.S. But thankful for the effort of our European-based and Canadian-based allies for what they have done. But also, it's very clear they want them to do a little bit more as well. And so in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, part of our job, and I'll end here, part of our job is to communicate to our friends and allies who are in the NATO PA that we made pledges and commitments in Wales. We're moving towards commitments in The Hague. And we're going to be bipartisan in our support with our allies to say we need you to keep these investments going, keep them going, because we do think it's important as a country, and people in our country think it's important. So I wanted to kind of answer it that way and get it started from my end of things.
Thank you for that. Thank your son for us.
I will do that.
Yeah.
I will do that. He sometimes, he loves his country, and sometimes he loves his parents just as much.
Now and again. Representative Dunn, what would be your approach to that same question?
So I actually have a very fortunate district. In fact, Florida has been rated as the most friendly military state in the country, and so trumping up support for NATO is really not a heavy lift in Florida. I will say that there are some people who don't understand it, and like Rick, I come from a multi-generation military family. I served, and my son served, my father, all of them go way back. everybody did their service. It never was a question when I was growing up if we were going to be serving or if we should be in NATO. In fact, just dial back the clock a little bit. In the 70s and 80s, we were spending 8 and 9% of our GDP on defense. So 5% was not that unreasonable. Of course, back then, when I was a young officer, we had about 300,000 active duty troops in Europe. So you knew we were going to be there. Now we're down to about 30,000. We still need to show the commitment. I think we still have all the same reasons to be in Europe. Europe probably has the most war-torn history of any continent. And all the continents are war-torn, but Europe has been at war more or less constantly for the last several thousand years since the Pax Romana ended. This NATO is a blessing for peace, and it is the best insurance we have for peace. The ancient Romans had a saying for the si vis pacem parabellum. If you wish for peace, prepare for war. And, preparing that, in that sense, peace is expensive. The only thing more expensive than peace is war. And the Romans were right. And I think they're absolutely right. If you look up the arc of history, that's the single biggest lesson. If you wish peace, prepare for war. That which you will not defend will be taken from you by somebody sooner or later. So I'm fortunate, as I say, to have a good population back home. I don't have a hard time selling NATO. I obviously am a real believer in NATO as well. And we believe in being there for Europe. We got to keep the peace. By the way, I think this also should extend to, you mentioned this too, Ambassador, that this should extend to the rest of the free world as well. So NATO has begun to realize that they actually have interest in Indo-Pac as well as the Atlantic. This used to be considered kind of an Atlantic treaty. And if I remember when on the NATO PA, if you started bringing up the Indo-Pacific, you'd be shouted down because they say, this is an Atlantic treaty. We don't have to do anything with the Philippines, yada, yada. Now that doesn't happen anymore. They recognize, all of our NATO allies recognize that they have deep, deep interests in the Indo-Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, all of Asia, and we should be cooperating together on these things. And in fact, that was the report that we gave last in 2024. The NATO report included that, and Secretary General Stoltenberg, Jens Stoltenberg, said on his farewell speech, there were two things that he emphasized. He emphasized winning in Ukraine, and NATO must, as an alliance, pay more attention to its interests in the Indo-Pacific. And let me close with a comment that I'm so happy we enlarged NATO, included Finland and Sweden recently. Those are really, really, really good additions. Finland has a 1.5 million man standing army. That's their reserve, but that almost doubles the size of NATO's armed forces. And Sweden, of course, has very, very sophisticated air and naval forces. So great additions to the NATO alliance. I'd like to see us add some more.
Absolutely. You just look at the map and you see the meaning of those two. So Representative Larson talked about Ukraine, so I'll start with you, Congressman Dunn. How does that translate support for NATO? They're not the same, they're different situations, but related. How does support for Ukraine and Russia's war against it support? Do your constituents want us to less, do more? There's a big debate going on right now.
I think there is some controversy about Ukraine. Having said that, that's not controversial to me. I was a soldier. I look at Ukraine and what they've accomplished with how little they had to start. It's an amazing outcome that we are 3 years into this, and they are still fighting Russia to a standstill. That is what a brilliant accomplishment, and I think they need to win. And they need to win for more than just Ukraine. I think that their example in Ukraine has been a lesson and a message to China about its adventurism in the Indo-Pacific, specifically Taiwan. Most of the people I know think that China would have invaded Taiwan very shortly after Russia took over Ukraine. And obviously, Russia didn't take over Ukraine, and the Chinese are looking at the Russians' example there, and I think they're saying this invasion stuff is harder than it looks.
Congressman Larson, Ukraine.
Again, it's pretty easy to talk about it in my district because of the relatively larger population of folks who fled Russia during the Soviet Union, refugees right after the fall, and then folks coming as well to the United States from Ukraine since the war, which we need to continue to welcome them into the United States, in my view. The challenge that well, there's a lot of challenges, but in the last cycle in Congress, I think we took 5 or 6 separate votes on Ukraine support. Not one of them got less than 311 votes in the U.S. House of Representatives. That number of votes is still there, still very strong. If you put a Ukraine aid package on the floor of the House today, you'd have well over 300 votes for that. So the center of gravity in Congress from members of Congress is still support Ukraine with aid. I think the other thing to think about is this is all part of some calculations, but if there's a ceasefire, if there's a long-term deal, there's still a lot of concern that Russia will just reconstitute, Putin will just reconstitute the military over the year, 2 years, or 3 years. And other good friends and, in fact, allies who are under NATO's treaty, Article 5, like the Baltic countries, will be next. It's a very real concern. I presume there'll be discussion about this at The Hague. And this is why that's important. NATO is fundamentally a military alliance. Now, when it was created, there were 12 members, and a few of them were dictatorships. They aren't anymore, but it wasn't an alliance of democracies. It was an alliance of countries in Europe, and it was a military alliance against the Soviet Union. Largely, NATO members are all democracies now, struggling, a few of them, one in particular backsliding altogether, in my view, but still a democracy. So it's not just a military alliance, it's a place where countries of similar values, that we do democracy a little bit differently in the US than our parliamentary friends, which we're reminded of every time we're here or every time we meet with them. But still, it's an alliance made up of largely democracies, again, with a few of the challenges. So we're not just defending militaries. We're not just defending, it's not just a military alliance. We're in the business of defending a value of freedom and a value of democracy. And we shouldn't be thinking about giving that up. But Russia and Putin is really pushing against that. And if you don't believe me, then go talk to your Latvian friends, go talk to your Estonian friends, your Lithuanian friends, your Polish friends. They will tell you exactly what Russia is doing. Sometimes it's military, sometimes through cyber means as well, a constant barrage of messages challenging even the value of democracy. And so we've got bigger values to think about when it comes to the NATO alliance, different than when it was constituted in 1949.
Thank you for that. Back to you, Ambassador Whitaker. As you know, I was with a delegation in Brussels meeting with NATO and EU officials. Never in all my years traveling to Europe, living in Europe, I lived there for 25 years, have I heard EU officials so focused on defense spending and defense production, and particularly regarding Ukraine. There's a new intensity to it, but it's new. The EU hasn't taken on this kind of defense role before. There's talk about $800 billion in new spending. Certainly, we talked about before, results in no small part of the pressure President Trump's put on, but of course, Putin's threat. But here's my question. Europeans, even while motivated to defend themselves better, worry about the U.S. withdrawing its military support from the theater before they're fully ready, and perhaps even troops. What do you tell your concerned European friends?
To quit worrying and to spend more on their own defense. I mean, this is you know, I found that the old adage that when you finally get tired of saying a message is when it's finally maybe starting to break through. And that's, you know, this reassurance that I have to provide to our European allies that the United States of America is, you know, is going to be a part of NATO. We expect them to do more to equalize all of the things I talked about earlier. But, you know, of course the United States is always going to look at our force posture, how we're deployed across the globe, and ask, does it make sense to the current threats? And, you know, one of the things that, as I've spent time in Europe, is they keep telling me is that Russia is the greatest threat to the Euro-Atlantic alliance. And I don't disagree with that. Our greatest strategic threat, as I've said many times, over the next century is our competition with China and what that looks like. But Europe has an economy that is 10 times larger than Russia. And so if they're really concerned about Russia and the reconstitution and the war machine of Putin, then they have all the resources they need to address it. And you mentioned the $800 million from the EU that they're going to spend, and that's great. There's another 800 billion, another 150 billion from the EU in a loan facility that folks are going to get access to. And then you have certain countries like Germany that have given themselves constitutional relief to invest more in their own defense. So a lot of great things are happening. This is a little bit of a trust but verify situation, though. It's one thing to say the words, we're going to spend more. It's an entirely different thing to actually do it. And so we're going to be, you know, as soon as we get this new Hague defense commitment from all 32 allies, then the real work begins as to how do we make sure that we spend money on real capabilities and not just inflation. Because everybody wants U.S. military systems. Everybody wants Patriot missile batteries. Everyone wants HIMARS. Everyone wants F-35s. That's great. We can only make so many in the near term. And if you believe the estimates that I've read publicly, you know, for Russia, once there's a peace in Ukraine to reconstitute, it's going to take anywhere from 2 to 5 years. And so, you know, and again, that just depends. But, you know, our allies that see it the closest, the Poles, the Baltics, are already at 5% spending or will be there next year. I was in Estonia last weekend and saw the hybrid threats and what Russia's doing with the Shadow Fleet, what they're doing in the Baltic Sea, what they're doing with some of their reckless behaviors. And if you live in those countries closest to the Russian border, where they are rebuilding their forts, their outposts, their military installations. If you're in Finland, if you're anywhere along that border, you know what the real threat is and why NATO is relevant to your life. Not only does it provide a U.S. kind of partner who is again the strongest military that the world has ever seen, but it also is the most innovative economy that the world has ever seen as well. And we can't lose either one of those. I just had a chance to visit with some defense folks that are making cutting edge technologies. Joby up in Springfield that's making these really cool electric vehicles, vertical takeoff and landing vehicles. I met with the Anduril people who are putting a big facility down in Columbus. I'm going to go see the tank plant tomorrow. There's a lot of great things happening here in Ohio and nationwide. And there's a reason that everybody wants to buy American armaments, but that's not going to be enough to supply this demand signal that we're getting from all of our allies. And so we're going to have to lean into our Indo-Pacific partners, ones that are great manufacturers like Japan and South Korea. And at the same time, we're going to have to work in building capacity. Part of this new defense commitment is that capital to build capacity, to build more basic armaments like 155 shells and medium caliber ammunition, all the types of things that are necessary to fight this war. And I think that's what, as we watch the battlefield in Ukraine and the slaughter that's happening, where 5,000 people, including civilians, are dying every week in this war. It's it's a different style of warfare. You can't bring a tank within 5 kilometers. I'm starting to be a European, that's scary. Within 2.5 miles of the front line, because again, these drones and these one-way attack drones that are hooked to fiber optic cables will take a tank out. And so it's just a different style of warfare than we've seen, and we need to adjust very quickly. And again, only the United States can innovate like this. You know, sclerotic Europe, old Europe, has so many regulations, and the EU is part of the problem. They're just having a hard time ramping this up, but they're going to figure it out. But we're also going to see tremendous opportunities for American technology and American investment opportunities to manufacture on the European continent as well. So, I mean, this is an exciting time to be NATO ambassador. You can tell that I'm enjoying myself so far, but the work is plentiful. There's a lot of work to do in the near term to get this security posture right, so that Russia doesn't attack a NATO country, so that we never have to worry about exercising Article 5, and that we have peace through strength. And that is, it's something I'm preaching every single day when I'm there in Brussels.
Thank you, Ambassador. Let me follow up a little bit on the defense industrial base question. Maybe this goes to the representatives as well. So it was good that you mentioned Anduril's Arsenal 1 facility in Ohio, Columbus, to hyperscale defense production to benefit the NATO alliance. BAE Systems, a British defense industrial company, has a facility right here in Dayton, I believe. If the Europeans spend more, they will be under political pressure to spend more of that money in Europe and not just in the United States, and create jobs in Europe. And as they're drawing up these laws, there's some pressure also, understandable pressure on representatives to do that. On the other hand, you underscored that a lot of this is only available in the United States. How do you think that sorts itself out? And because obviously we want the Europeans to be able to build more themselves, but we also want them to buy more from us at the same time.
I mean, I think it's an all of the above approach. And when you're spending another $300 to $500 billion a year in 10 years, $3 to $5 trillion on defense material. I mean, it's just, you're going to have to get it from the Israelis. You're going to have to create your own industrial capacity in Europe, and you're going to have to buy the best systems from the United States, as well as things that are available from our other allies. And I think, the nice thing about the capability targets that have been developed at NATO is that everybody knows what they're supposed to have in the cupboard and ready to go, and including the United States. And we are an ally. We are a part of NATO, and so therefore we need to step up with what we have. The good news is we did not take a peace dividend like the Europeans have. And we have always, being the world's only superpower, we've always had to have the ability to project power. We just can't project power for everybody at all times, and I think that's the nice thing about this conversation that's ongoing.
So, Representatives Larson and Dunn, perhaps deal with this as well, but if you could do this also on the defense industrial issue, if you have thoughts there. New announcement today that drove markets from Trump about new tariffs on Europe, because Europe's not moving fast enough. How does this work together with what we're wanting from Europe in terms of its defense spending? Are they separate issues? Are they related issues? In Europe, I felt when I was talking to some European officials, they felt it was related issues, and that they shouldn't be treated in the same way we treat adversaries when it comes to trade issues. I'd like to start with the two of you.
I'll just start by saying that this ends at 2:30, and I'll only be halfway done with my answer if that's the case. So rather than jump into that, I'll just say generally, as a member of Congress from the Pacific Northwest, we hate tariffs. Period. Tariffs are tools; they're not the tool. We like trade deals better. Tariffs don't work for us. But that's. Maybe we can do Dayton Dialogue 2.0 on the international economy. We can have that deeper conversation. That said, when I was on a congressional delegation trip. We call it a shorthand for those that don't know. It's called a CODEL, congressional delegation trip to Europe, to Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden in April, with the head of the Armed Services Committee, a guy named Mike Rogers. Neil and I know, a great friend of ours. to talk about the defense industrial base. The tariffs issue came up in every conversation that we had with the leaders there. We met with 2 prime ministers and ministers of defense and so on. So it comes up, but it also trade or tariffs is kind of a separate issue for other committees as well, kind of thing. So it didn't really come up as part of the grand bargain discussions. But when we talked about the defense industrial base, I think it's important, and nothing against the term capability targets, but if we're going to talk to everyday Americans, we need to get away from terms like capability targets. And it's really what we're asking.
I've already turned into a bureaucrat.
Yeah, I know, yeah. And a European, apparently.
Yeah, no, this is horrible. This is a nightmare. I'm not a European because I don't like the food over there, to be honest with you. No Chick-fil-A, which is horrible to me.
All right, well, Chick-fil-A is going to be tariff-free in Europe.
With ketchup.
So essentially what we're asking all allies is to consider, what do you do best in the world of the industrial base? So what do you make the best of? What do you do the best of? So the Dutch talked a lot about their work in sensors and drone manufacturing and drone usage. The Danes have their list of things. Think about the United States. We kind of do a lot of things really well, honestly, when you think about the defense industrial base, and you think about any kind of manufacturing. We do a lot of things really well. So we kind of have the suite of things, whereas any one country in Europe might be able to do 2 or 3 things really well. And then what we're saying is, like, we want you to do that and make that the focus of the contribution of the investment you're making to the broader NATO defense industrial base. When you do that, what happens is you get a much more common operational picture. You get a more common standards among the allies as well, in terms of the standards to which you build up to. Think about training. If you're training people, you're training the soldiers who from the different countries who are in Lithuania and Estonia. When we're training them all to a standard, so the same standard, so they can work together. Interoperability, it's called, and they can work together. Basically thinking about that principle, that concept when it comes to capability targets. When you're investing in these things so that we're investing to a NATO standard, not just what we want, but how it's used, how it's made. And that way, then you can have any one country's military begin to actually shop around among allies, and they'll benefit. Now, it's a massive coordination problem to do that, but we're in a better spot to be able to try to do that than we have in the past. And we have companies in my district and my state that will be part of all that, part of that now, and certainly in Florida and other states around the country. But that's what we're trying to achieve. When you do that as well, then European allies can feel, the European allies in NATO and Canadian allies can feel better about those investments that they're making as well, as opposed to just trying to hit a number, which is one of the challenges that we have. People just trying to hit a 2% number, regardless of what they're spending 2% on.
Thank you. So Congressman Dunn, question of tariffs, question of defense spending, related, not related. The Europeans would argue, if we slow down our growth, if we can't trade as well, if we may have to turn to China for trade, where you urged us to turn away from that. We may not have enough money to increase our defense spending, but what's your answer to that?
So let me start by saying good news on the defense industrial base. This year, the report is going to come out from NATO. It's going to be all about the defense industrial base on both sides of the Atlantic. We need to increase it in America and Canada and also over in Europe. And there's a real commitment to that. So that's I'm actually the author of that report. Share it with you. Tomorrow we'll be discussing that in some depth. So the defense industrial base is going to get the investments. It's going to grow. It is going to diversify. And I like what Rick said about the training as well. In fact, we had a kind of a ground level view on the training for the Ukrainians. In 2014, we started sending the Florida National Guard to Ukraine to train them in interoperability and defense tactics. And that turned out to pay off pretty well in 2021. That was a big payoff. So I think there is good news. 22, I should say. That was a good thing. Now, in terms of does trade affect defense buildups? Yes, it does. I agree with Rick that tariffs tend to be a headwind for everybody. It's a tit for tat thing. I think where you have what we're trying to correct there with the tariffs, I think, is other parts of the trade barriers. So the tariffs are not that punitive to us. That we complain because we get more tariffs put on us than we put on other people, or we did historically. But it's more about the tax systems and the tax export, rebates on export, things like that. So we're talking tariffs, but really we need to be talking about trade barriers. A much more complex subject, takes longer to solve.
So, Ambassador, I know that your trade is not your portfolio in your job, but does it come up with your European counterparts?
Yeah, surprisingly not. I mean, it is certainly in a context that we're all aware of is out there, but most of that the EU handles all the trade negotiations for the member states, and I think there's 26, 28 NATO members that are also EU members and vice versa. And so, I mean, there's certainly some overlap, but it's not coming up in our regular discussions. I mean, that's the nice thing. It's a defensive alliance, a military alliance that's focused on those issues, and it's not broad like the UN, where there's all sorts of different countries or anything. So. But it is certainly context. And again, I think these issues will sort out pretty quickly. I mean, President Trump obviously is creating an environment to negotiate these so that the American people aren't getting screwed. I mean, think about, we had a $300 billion yearly trade deficit with China. We have a $250 billion yearly trade deficit with the EU. And, and at the same time, they want all our F-35s and Patriot missiles and everything we can make. So it's not a matter of us not making great stuff that the world wants. It's just that they've created barriers to not take American manufactured items. And so I think, again, I think these issues will get resolved, will be negotiated out. And I think President Trump's just trying to create the environment to cut the best possible deal for the American people.
Thank you for that. So we're down to the last 5 minutes. I wonder if you each will start with from far left politically, and then
said no one ever about Neil.
Come back to Ambassador.
Start on the right.
So what advice would you have for NATO in terms of communicating with the everyday American? We did Bob Hope and Roger Staubach. I don't know whether it was effective or not. You'd have to go back and look at the time. What needs to be said now? Or are you sanguine? Do you think the support is going to be there forevermore for NATO, or does NATO need to communicate a little bit better here?
Well, I guess I always thought that it was my job to communicate to my district about NATO, not NATO's job. NATO's job is to fight the fight. I'll leave that to the ambassador, but I think it's up to us to go back home and talk to people, and I do. And I get people who push back and say, "Why are we in Europe? Why are foreign wars, forever wars?" I say these things. I said, "Don't talk to me about that stuff." I said, "My son in Afghanistan for years. You got to do this stuff. You have to. I mean, this is what how you protect freedom, how you protect your families. Suck it up. we need to be there."
Good answer, Representative Larson.
I was just thinking a picture of me in my district telling my constituents to suck it up. It just wouldn't fly exactly well. I think, but the fundamental point Neil's made, though, about being a leader in your district, and sometimes, if the polling in my district was 20% for NATO, I'd still be for NATO. Sometimes you don't look to the polls the polling to tell you what you think you ought to be doing all the time, and it's just so you have to think about as an elected in a district, to think about what are you willing to say, what are you willing to spend your time on, break a pick on, in order to communicate. And one of those is it's important for me, and it's my job to try to explain things, and it's also my job to criticize NATO and allies when it's the right thing to criticize them on and criticize it as an organization on. It is trying to change. The organization itself is trying to change. I was active with getting Pentagon support for NATO's investment in its innovation accelerator. It's called DIANA, but it stands for the Defense Innovation Accelerator for North America, Project DIANA. But this is the whole idea of NATO NATO as an organization understanding that in order to be a fighting force and to be an alliance, a military alliance, that it needs to think about things beyond tanks and guns and bullets, but think about cybersecurity, think about the role that artificial intelligence plays in military planning, think about these other things, and this innovation accelerator is part of that. So it's a data point to use to communicate to my constituents that NATO just isn't this static thing that's sucking money out of U.S. taxpayers, which I don't believe it is. But you have to counter that argument with other things as well and be knowledgeable and be willing to lead at home. And before we get past the representatives, I want to recognize Don Beyer from Congressman from Virginia is in the front row as well, another great leader who was an ambassador to Switzerland during the Obama administration as well. So he knows a little bit something about European politics as well, and is a great, and also is not yet, but is getting his PhD in artificial intelligence as well. I'm a member of Congress. All of my intelligence is in fact artificial. He's actually getting a degree in it.
By the way, for those who can't see the congressman in the front row, he's also wearing an American and Ukrainian flag on his lapel too, so that's also a nice time. Ambassador Whitaker, you have the final word.
Well, first of all, Fred, thank you for moderating this discussion. This has been wonderful. You and I tried to get together several times before I was confirmed to talk about these issues. We never had a chance, but now we've somehow been together, even though we were in the same city for a while in D.C. Now we figured out a way to get together in Brussels and Dayton, Ohio. So in a week. So that's pretty amazing. And I enjoyed our conversation, gentlemen. You guys are both statesmen, and really appreciate sort of everything you're doing to make sure that Americans and everybody that we love and care about understands and appreciates what we're doing at NATO. And you mentioned it, whether it's cyber, whether it's AI, whether it's missile defense, whether it's space, NATO needs to be an innovative organization. It needs to address new threats, asymmetrical threats, and we need to, again, bring all of our allies under a common roof to make sure that we can address all the challenges and all the security issues that we might have in Europe and in the North Atlantic region. And, again, I often say this, but I truly mean it, is, as the United States of America, we are the world's superpower. We are going to be challenged. There's no doubt about that if you look into the future, and we're going to need friends. And NATO is a great alliance to get together with our friends and our allies and make sure that we're as strong as we possibly can be so that we have peace for generations to come.
Ambassador, I think any good moderator knows not to say anything on top of that. So let's close there. Thanks to Ambassador Whitaker, Representatives Larson and Dunn. Thank you.
Thank you.